Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for Conserving a Legacy, Preservation in Action at the Thorsen House. My name is Alex Rassick, and I am the Executive Director here at the Gamble House. And I am joined today by Sam Snow, who welcomed you as you came onto the Zoom. Sam is our Programs Manager, and Jennifer Trotu, our Director of Collections and Interpretation. If you have any technical questions or needs during the program, please drop a message in the chat and Sam will do her very best to support you. Throughout the program, we encourage you to place any questions you have for our speaker, Christopher Yerke, in the chat as well. We love questions and we know you will have some. Following his presentation, Jennifer is going to facilitate a Q&A session with Chris. May, as many of you know, is National Preservation Month, which began as National Preservation Week back in 1973. In 2005, the National Trust for Historic Preservation extended the celebration to the entire month to provide an even greater opportunity to celebrate the diverse and unique heritage of communities throughout the nation. In honor of Preservation Month, we are excited to host this program about the recent restoration work of Greene & Greene's William R Thorsen House with project lead Christopher Yerke. Built in 1909. Ooh, I think I'm hearing some feedback. Are you hearing that too, Sam? No? Are others hearing some feedback? Yes?
Yes.
No.
Yeah.
Let's see if we can figure out why that is.
John Hamm, I think you're
No feedback.
Okay, let's try that. Is that better? Okay. Everyone, no feedback? All right, perfect.
No feedback.
Okay, so John, we're going to keep you muted because I think the feedback is coming through yours. There you go. All right. So as I was saying, in honor of Preservation Month, we are so excited to host this program about the recent restoration work of the Thorsen House with project lead Christopher Yerke. Built in 1909, the house is recognized as one of Greene & Greene's ultimate bungalows. And if you've had the opportunity to see it, you understand why it has this designation. Since 1942, the house has been owned and cared for by the Sigma Phi Society of California, and some of you might be aware that our Director Emeritus, Ted Bosley, is a member and had the opportunity to live in the house when he was studying at Berkeley. The house is a California State Historic Landmark and is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. We are so pleased to have Chris here to tell us about how he and the restoration team were able to address damage to the house caused by rot and insects, restore structural integrity, and ensure seismic durability. The team was recently recognized for their achievements by the California Preservation Foundation with a 2026 Preservation Design Award in Craftsmanship Preservation in the Craftsmanship and Preservation Technology category. And now just a little bit about Chris. Christopher Yerke is a general contractor and founder of Restoration Workshop Ltd., a San Francisco construction firm dedicated to restoration of fine historic homes of any style. A dedicated old house mechanic, I love that. He works to preserve the legacy of his forebears in the trades by designating and crafting thoughtful solutions to fix the ravages of time. Restoration Workshop is dedicated to training future generations in this love of craft through working apprenticeships, which is so desperately needed, and we're so grateful for that, Chris. So we turn the reins over to you and very much look forward to your presentation. So Chris, you're muted.
There we go. Are we there? Okay. I kept getting, I was muted while you were speaking, and it kept telling me the host is not allowing people to unmute themselves. And so I was about to go into sign language. So, good evening, everyone. I'm glad to share some of our adventures with you. I assume at this point that I don't need to say much about Greene and Greene because I'm sure you're all more than familiar with the general history of the architects themselves. So I'm going to go through what was a very complex project, and I'm going to try and do it as concisely as possible. There's a lot of detail that kind of fell down into several different categories, but what you're looking at on the screen right now is a shot of this several years ago, this covered terrace. And the object was going to be to remove these posts because they had rot at the base and they're not really connected in a very seismically competent way. And so we were approached by the California Sigma Phi Society and Thomas Saxby specifically, who is an architect and also a member and had lived in the house at one point also. And it's hard to really describe to people, especially if they're not necessarily deeply involved in craft, exactly how special and unusual these houses really are. The Greenes were really trying to make nature manifest in all of the visible materials, in the siding of the house relative to the environment. And in the end, they created some masterpieces that are essentially a huge piece of furniture. And when you're going to apply sort of furniture level acumen to something of this scale, it's an absolute testament to the original artisans who built this house, because what we found there was that everything, apart from any ravages of time or deterioration caused by nature, everything really still fit so beautifully. And so when we did get approached, let's see if I can now, I've got to get my slideshow to advance to the next slide. This is complicated. All right. Let's see, how can I do this? Interesting. If you give me just a moment, I'm having the technical difficulty of looking at the Zoom screen and not being able to tell PowerPoint how to advance. Let's see. All right.
Chris, I also have your presentation, so if you need me to present your slides, let me know.
Yeah. This wasn't happening earlier, so I'm mildly confused by this, but let's see. I am screen sharing. We may have to do that because it's, I'm looking at my screen within this screen, and it is not really allowing me to interact with it. Unless you have a suggestion, Sam, as to how that could move. Okay.
Can you see your slides on my screen now?
I can.
Okay.
I can.
Just tell me when to advance.
All right. So let's go ahead to the next slide. Oops, one too many. All right. So before I get too far into the weeds of this, one thing I'd like to point out about restoration and preservation projects like this is, in general, they don't happen at the whim of one person. It really does take a village. And I wanted to give a shout out to several of the people who have participated in all this and made it possible. Namely the California Sigma Phi Society, first of all, for their years of stewardship of the house. And they've put considerable time and effort into preservation of the house and have done a lot of work on it themselves. We were approached by Thomas Saxby, the architect, Rick Travers, who is a project manager for the house and sort of the house manager and really facilitated access and answered questions for us along with Tom. I put Jerry Barkley here, who's on the board for Leap of Faith, precisely because he's a construction guy, and and as many of the board members were very concerned about cost and where this was going to go. And unfortunately, with a project like this, there's no way to give you a concise answer of exactly what this is going to cost, because exactly what you have to do is going to be discovered in the process of doing it. We were going to have to essentially dismantle those posts and do a lot of conservation work on them. And in the end, he decided that, we were the sorts of guys he wanted working on it, and supported us in going, allowing us to go forward and do the job. We had a structural engineer involved as well, which was very important to determine, the strength of the, seismic connectors and the quality of the splices, and, basically set the goals for structurally what needed to happen. And then my team, I have a project manager, Matt Borup, who was absolutely brilliant at keeping things happening in the field. And then my carpenters, Nathan Squire, Claudio Munoz, Brian Vortman, Mason Heimberger, Alex Brager. You will be seeing them throughout the photos because they were in the act of doing the restoration. And then finally, we did lift the building and shore it up in place. So we had on our team was steel core builders. Sam, if you would go ahead to the next slide. So there were plans. Thomas came to us with these plans, and you can see that he has called out these 4 posts. The posts themselves had issues in the bases with rot and deterioration. There were questions about how well they were actually connected to the masonry below them. And they were, getting pretty concerned about the structural strength of these guys. There was a little bit of settling, some things to watch out for. If you could go to the next slide. A little bit closer up, you can see the 4 posts. And of course, there's no way to remove these posts and work on them without dismantling this lovely timber puzzle that the Greenes had designed. Since the cross beams are mortised all the way through, there's buttresses on the outside held by the metal straps. And there's the corbels that are there. All of these things have tenons into their adjoining members and are pinned in place. If you look down at the lower section here, and I'm, one thing I think we lost, Sam, by giving you this is the control is that I can't point to things. There you go. So you can see at the base of these posts, if you go down to the very base of those, you can see there's like a little shaded area, which was, the theoretical indication inside the post of how much rot we would find, after the buttresses came off. So go to the next page, please. And then you can see here structural details showing how we were to remove the compromised wood at the bottom and make a timber splice. That where it says post base repair, Sam, right in the second row, second in, you can see there was this sort of puzzle joint splice that was going to need to be put on the bottom of the posts. And we did have, a set of goals and structural things to operate from. Next slide, please. So a little bit of triage. These are from Thomas Saxby's photographs before we were brought to the project. So you see everything here is still assembled. The metal straps are holding on to exterior buttresses that go on either side of a core post that is an 8x10 piece of perfect timber. And the quality of all this wood is pretty extraordinary. You will notice that the posts facing the exterior show signs of a great deal of weathering. There's deep checks and cracks, sometimes multiple inches all the way in. You can see at the base, there's a little bit of rot peeking out in one of the buttresses there. And everything is gray and weathered and pretty monochromatic. So now if you will go to the next slide. Actually, Sam, let's go back a few slides. In my version of this, I had added one more slide in there. Let's go back to the picture that shows, it says it takes a village, and it shows the Greenes. Or the crew that built it. Okay, so if you look in this picture, you can see Charles Greene is actually hanging out in the back behind the post there. And these are the guys who built the house, and they're posing for a lovely photo. But if you look at the posts, you will notice they are a light, presumably fairly natural Douglas fir color. And if you look up at the beam that they're connected to and the window heads and all the actual timber on the house, you'll see that that was deliberately a darker color. So it was meant to have this kind of two-tone scheme. So now let's advance back to where we were and go one more slide. There we go. So this is what it looked like when we were called to the project. California Sigma Phi had been trying to figure out how to do this and dismantle all this. So you can see the buttresses and the metal straps have been removed from the posts, and they had done a little bit of sanding to the cross beams because they were swollen enough and tight in the mortises, and they have to be slid out sideways. So they had to do a little bit of sanding to those in order to reduce the friction to be able to take them out. And they had done some experiments with that. But of course, you can't really start taking all this apart unless you have the building shored up in place so that you can hold up that very heavy 3 stories that is above it. Could you go to the next slide, please? All right. So in process a little bit here, you can see that at the base of the post on the left, the rot was really pretty advanced. In some places, it went almost a foot up the post, and it was not just rot, it was actually insect damage. There had been dampwood termites that had been feeding on this presumably throughout the winter when it would be sitting in water. The posts themselves are just sitting on a little terracotta pad that you see there, surrounded by brick, and there is a masonry foundation below this. And if you look at the right, this is when we're sort of in process of getting ready for the shoring. And this was a little complicated because the beams to the left and to the right were short enough that you could pull them out between the other posts. But this beam was so long that when you slide it sideways, it goes into the next post before you can get the opposite end out. So we had to slide it over into a position. We had to remove the corbels. We had to cut some tenons and slide it into a position that once we were able to remove one post, we'd be able to get it back out. And then we would have to reassemble all this in reverse order. Next slide, please. All right, so how do you do this? We brought in a lot of cribbing and made cribbing towers. There's actually 2 of them that are back on the covered terrace that you can't see. And there's a series of steel I-beams that are crisscrossing all of this. And this had to be put together in a way that we could still work on all our post connections. The supports were not in our way. And we needed to really distribute the load very evenly over the ground and the bricks inside the terrace because we didn't want to do any damage to any of the brick or terracotta. So if you could please advance to the next slide. All right, so you get a little bit better view. You can sort of see how these beams are kind of moving past our connection points and avoiding splices and avoiding corbels. And if you look in the view to the right, you can kind of look down the line and see that we had room to either side to be able to walk through there and actually work on all this. You can see sort of coming down, there's the angled struts from the fire escape above that had to be, accommodated to disassemble to be able to put back, etc. Next slide, please. And interestingly enough, to protect where the buttresses were sitting up against these posts, the Greenes had put in these little copper counter flashings, and they had used these little square boat nails that square nails are not something you find in hardware stores anymore. Copper nails are not very common either. And I really didn't like the idea of, some of the nails were missing. We reused everything that was still there, but I didn't like the idea of not replacing them in kind. And after a bit of searching, I found a little mom and pop boat building shop in the East Coast in Rhode Island and was able to actually get the same square cut copper boat nails that were originally used so that we were able to replace anything we needed in kind. If you look to the right in that frame, you can see we had to lift the house a little bit. So we, got jacks under those beams and lifted the house about 1/4 of an inch, just enough so that we could slide a saw between the beam above and you see the tenon that's going up in through that post, because you couldn't tip the bottom out enough to pull that large and very long tenon out of there. So that tenon had to go away, and it would later be replaced with a timber connector that is, has a great deal of strength for making good seismic connections. Next slide, please. All right, so what do you do when you've got everything taken apart? You take it back to your shop, and the first step was just cleaning. This was a really important element of this job, was to try and restore that color balance with the darker beam above and a clearer, more of a cedar tone kind of structure below on the buttresses, on the posts, on the corbels, and on the cross beams. And in good conservation fashion, nobody wanted to get in here and start sanding these and altering the surface texture. You know, that it is weathered over time. That surface texture all is shared, blends very well together, and blends with the rest of the house around it. So we didn't want to lose anything of the surface quality, but we did want to get some color back. So if you look at the frame on the left, you'll see the buttress on the left of that stack was on the inside, not facing the weather. It's got a lot of some sort of very opaque, not transparent stain on it, dark brown. And then you can see just weathered and gray furrowed wood in the ones that were facing outward. And when you're doing this kind of work, you tend to start with the least aggressive cleaner you can. So we started with D2 biological cleaner and began the process of just a lot of gentle wire brushing. We began to call it toothbrushing, and just spent several hours going over all of these things, more than one pass of D2. Now, if you can go to the next slide, please, Sam. All right. Now, I'm going to kind of run around these frames, but if you look at the upper left, you'll see that after all the scrubbing in the world, you still had a pretty dirty surface. And if you look at the frame below that, still in the left column, you'll see that there is a lot of leftover sort of balled up old oil, old stain, organic contaminants, just all in a mush. And the D2 was not going to touch that. And one of the problems with these sorts of projects, especially there's budget concerns, but you want to improve the look. You also, in the end, want this thing to accept the new stain product that we're going to use on it. And if it can't absorb in very well because of all these contaminants, then you're not really going to achieve your goal. So then we had to go back to California Sigma Phi Society and Tom and Rick and say, this really isn't clean enough. We're going to have to get a little more aggressive here. Do you approve? And of course they felt the same way. And so then we started stripping. So we used a fairly environmentally friendly, as things go, chemical stripper, and we would spread it on, wrap these things in plastic, just leave them to sit there and let the stripper do its work. And then come back later and take off the plastic and begin rinsing and nylon brushing and, occasionally using a brass brush and getting it to the point where you see on the right a much, much cleaner surface. There still will be the patina, the iron staining from the straps. We're not going to be able to get an even color that's back to something that a brand new piece of Douglas fir would have, but it is greatly improved, and at least you don't see all the crusty things that are there. Next slide, please. All right, so here we have a substantially cleaner pile of timber you see on the left. And if you're glancing down, you'll see like the big pockets where the insides of some of these posts were completely rotted away at the bottom. And you look at the center frame and you see that the skyward pointing faces, these little steps in the buttresses, were very, very weathered well down into the end grain. And in some case, some of these checks, the big one you see, there's a couple of inches deep. And we did not want to see a bunch of epoxy, and we did not want any filler that would call attention to itself. On the other hand, if we just filled the surface of these cracks in a superficial sort of way, water would still get down in behind them and could be down inside the wood. And we didn't want to make that possible either. So if you look at the right, you'll see there's a piece of timber there with a bunch of little tape marks on it. And there's a tape mark back toward the back that says 8 a.m. And we're keeping track of we're doing this. And we're using a liquid clear epoxy, Abatron product, and we are syringing it down into these cracks, filling them up. And of course, it would run down into the crack and the level would subside and we would refill. And, after we do a round of filler, we'd mark the time we did it. And then we'd come back when the filler had time to cure. And then we'd do the next round until we had them filled up. There were some cases where there was bug damage and it went all the way through the back of the buttress. And so we had to put tape across the back or clamp blocks up there to keep all of the epoxy from running out onto the floor. And we did this until we had them full to within about 1/8 of an inch of the surface. Next slide, please. Then we had to deal with all of the rot at the base of things. And as a rule, if it was in a position where it could never be seen, we didn't bother pigmenting the epoxy. We would just basically get in there with, drill bit, Forstner bit, chisels, whatever it took to get rid of anything that was punky. Then we would treat it with liquid consolidating epoxy. And then after that, we would fill. Brian quickly figured out that as long as these buttresses were, that if you clamped them to the stairs, you could stand up on the stairs and easily work on the ends in a vertical fashion, which was much more convenient. So you see them fully filled on the right. Next slide, please. All right, now there were reconstructive surgeries that had to be done here as well. So in this case, you see on the left, this buttress had its surface wood compromised, and we wanted it to look like we were never there. So the first thing we did was to establish a solid block to work with. We cleaned it out and let a solid block of old growth Douglas fir into the bottom of the post. So we had something to work with. Then the center frame, you'll see that we took some old weathered Douglas fir from a beam that I'd been saving, an old Victorian beam, and gave it a wire brushing, cleaned it up, and made Dutchmen that we fitted in that, display a similar sort of weathered grain. And we really went out of our way to leave any existing wood in place. And then you can see how much the color of it stands out versus the wood around it. So then if you look in the right, you'll see somewhere in the middle, I'm in the process of kind of fauxing that in with earth pigments that I'm letting into the TWP 1500 linseed oil-based stain that we're using. And by the time I was done, there was a point where you really, for color or texture, you mostly wouldn't see it. You can still tell that it's cracked and furrowed, but that's pretty consistent with everything you see above. And then the bottom frame running across there was just one other thing I thought was amusing was there was a whole language of different pins. And those pins were, pinning tenons in place or, plugging other holes that were there for other reasons. And there were quite a few that were missing, and there were like a lot that we had to drill out and remove for this project. So we had to make several different sizes. They were all oak per the Greene's specifications. And anything that was going into the darker beams above had to have this dark walnut stain, and anything that was going into the posts and secondary beams below had to have this lighter sort of, it was I think it was cedar tone was the stain. And you're seeing these just after they've been dipped in aniline dye first, a waterborne dye, to really get some color in them, because oak doesn't just color very darkly with an oil-based stain alone. And then coated with the stain, and somebody would have been about to wipe these all back to make the, the finished plug product. Next slide, please. So then you look on the left. Now here we have what Douglas fir really tends to look like when you put an oil-based stain on it. It naturally goes a pretty deep orange. And you can see here that some of the exterior ones have iron staining and tannin staining and things. And we decided that that was going to be enough. One, partially for budgetary reasons, because by the time you pulled out oxalic acid and tried to bleach out everything you possibly could, you've created a whole nother issue. But also because we realized really that we were going to have to respect, some of what time had done to this. But they went from that gray, dull, lifeless appearance that you saw at the beginning to something that has kind of a vivid contrast. Now, when it came to filling these guys, and I believe, this is sort of conservator stuff, and I'm sure you did this to a lot of rafter tails at the Gamble House. We would start out with epoxy putty, and you can see various earth pigments. I've got trays and trays of them. And we would add pigment as much as we could. You can have about a 20%, by ratio, amount of filler you can put in without really substantially weakening the epoxy. And we would custom mix colors to match whatever the local conditions we were putting the epoxy in were. So when you see that this sort of a tiger stripe to these buttresses in the left-hand frame, if we were in an orange spot, we were doing orange. If we were in a darker spot, we were doing different colors. So, and that was really sitting there with dental picks, and it is in the upper right-hand frame. That's actually for picking walnuts out of shells. He is filling that in, and after filling it in, then we would take a tool and dip it in mineral spirits and smooth that out down into the crack. So it would become really rather imperceptible. And then if you look at the lower right-hand corner, those really damaged buttresses, we didn't want any water getting down into that grain and doing further damage. So after they had been filled with the liquid epoxy, then we did a really deep pack and fill with a heavily pigmented epoxy putty, which you see is partially in process. You can see to the left where we haven't got to it yet, and the right where we have. And then we, really went back and raked out the grain so that, we would still leave the texture and, but leave this protected. So if you go to the next slide, please. All right. So that was kind of cleaning, stripping, filling, and getting things ready to go. Now let's go back to the big problem, which was the rot in the bottom of the posts. So looking to the left there, you can see what they look like when we first pulled them out. Now there's a lot more rot than is apparent in this photo that you're looking at, because it goes way up there and we had to dig it all out. And then if you look on top of each one of those, there is a little chunk of pipe, and that was stuck into the masonry below, not even mortared in, and stuck up into, so like half of it's in the terrace below and half of it is up into the bottom of the post. That was as much as these had for a seismic connection at the bottom. They weren't all the same size, they weren't necessarily the same thickness, and they really weren't a tight fit. So they were sort of a registration pin that would keep the thing from sliding out in general, but not great. So of these 4 posts, there was one that we were able to simply do an epoxy repair and leave it alone, but the other ones had to be repaired. So one of the things that was keeping us up at night, and we were just hating it, was the idea of no matter how nice of a piece of timber we would find to splice these with, the grain would not match, and you would be looking at a timber splice at the bottom. Now the buttresses cover the shorter sides, the 8-inch sides of these, so you wouldn't see that, but looking at the 10-inch sides of these posts, the splice would be visible and it would be obvious. And so somewhere in all these conversations, Matt came up with the idea of, well, what if we sliced the original weathered sides, about 3/4 of an inch thick, off of the posts, about as high up as the repairs need to go, and then we set those aside, then we splice in our timber core, and then veneer those original sides back on. So all you would have visible is just the line where we had done the stop cut when we'd sliced them off in the first place. So you see the diagrams below. I've got kind of a transparent 3D view. I 3D model everything and was just kind of conceptually working my way through this. And then you can see the exploded view in the next view over. And there's several things to look at here. So those outer 2 pieces you see that have a hole in them, those are the original sides. Now, it's a reductive process. You're going to lose material from the saw curve when you slice those off. So there's a couple little odd pieces floating around in the middle, and those sort of represent filler that would have to, a piece of veneer that would have to go in there to make up for the lost material. The holes through everything on the side and in the splice in the bottom, and there's a notch in the bottom of that, those represent the timber connector that was going to have to be epoxy set with threaded rod into the terrace. And then these posts, remember, they can't tip in, they have to slide in sideways. So we have to slide it over the timber connector. And then there is a cross dowel, a metal cross dowel that expands. You put it through those holes from the side, you manipulate a screw that makes it expand, and it locks the whole thing down. And then that slot you see in the side will eventually get plugged with a piece of matching Douglas fir. So now on the right, you see the kind of unicorn timber that we got lucky and found. We spent a lot of time searching because mills really don't cut appearance grade Douglas fir anymore. It's mostly cut for the construction industry. It's knotty. It's not lovely to look at. And there is much looser grain. You rarely see this very tight grain. We found a 20-foot long beam in a salvage yard that miraculously enough had hardly any fastener holes in it. And we were able to use that. And we were delighted to have it, particularly when we thought before we had this idea of veneering the posts sides on there, because this is, you see the way the grain is running sort of diagonally across that. It is what we call rift sawn. And all of the original Greene and Green posts had about this density of grain, very, very hard, very dense Douglas fir, and they were all rift sawn, just like this. So this would have been a good candidate, but our solution in the end was better. Next slide, please. All right, so here's the crew in action. So looking at the upper left-hand frame, you'll see we're using a portable bandsaw, and you have to just pull that through the wood to slice the sides off. And if you look at the lower left frame, you'll see Claudio is cross-cutting the little stop cut. So we're going to cut up to that line and get this side pulled off. Go to the frame to the right of that, and you will see there is the bottom of a post. One of its sides is laying next to it. It is labeled because everything has to go back on the post it came off of. And there's the other side is sitting on top of the post, sort of behind his hand. And so there we have the beginnings of this tenon that we're going to leave. And you can see that we had cut up into it to probe the extent of the rot. Up above that, there were termite tunnels running up into the grain, in one case that went all the way up into the mortise for the crossbeam, but they weren't a structural issue. So go to the top middle frame, and you see that the guys are there cutting the splice. So we have to cross-cut these big splices, and then we also have to rip down the middle to get that. And then you see, that's on the post. That's the bottom of the post. They're preparing that. And then you see the next one to the right, they're actually cutting the mating puzzle piece, as it were, and getting it ready. So now, if you look at the big frame, the biggest picture below, what you'll see there are the 3 posts that we're splicing onto with their prepared timber splices, their sides removed, everything's labeled, everything's pretty well cleaned up. But I have to point out at this juncture that these posts were timber, first of all, when it dries, doesn't tend to stay square. The Greenes loved rounded corners on everything, and it's highly weathered. So the faces were not parallel to each other, nor were they square to their adjacent sides. So no matter what you do, use as a reference surface to cut something on this, it's not going to match something else. And yet in the end, when we veneer these sides back on and the splices go on, the veneered faces have to be dead parallel to what they came off of. So there's a lot of careful preparation to make that happen. So next slide, please. Now here we are before we've gone through the worst of it, but you can see there's the added splice, which is extra long at this point, sitting on the post it's going to be mated to. And you see its top is sitting on the top, and then I had Nathan hold it down in front so you can see what the end view is going to be, so that there really isn't anything other than that small saw cut, that is going to show you that something happened here. Because when the buttresses go back on, you cannot see the other faces for the splices. So then going to the upper right, the first thing that was specified was, there was epoxy, and then there were going to be timber screws to hold all this together. So, and plus just the interlocking nature of the splice is such that it makes it very difficult for it to come apart when it's in compression with all that weight sitting on it above. So the guys above are spreading marine epoxy in there with a special bonding filler. And you can see the one his hands are on behind has already been done. And then the whole thing gets pulled to with a set of clamps, and there's epoxy squeeze out, and then we clean all that off. Next slide, please. All right. And on the left-hand frame, you'll see that, now we've pre-drilled and countersunk for the timber screws, and those all get set in place. And then the next three frames, you'll see Nathan is reestablishing a reference face on the side of all this to make both splices meet in a way that's absolutely flat and allow the side that we're going to have to veneer on there to sit dead parallel to the side. So, you know, you can see he's chiseling and preparing the joint right at the base of the cut there. And at the bottom, he's hand planing that because this was done with a bandsaw, and bandsaws don't give you, you know, a planed smooth surface. And after all of the joint was adjusted, then he had to do some adjusting to the back of these to get the fit right. And you can see at the left-hand edge, away from at the opposite end from his hand plane, that, you know, there was a little bit of rot and loss into the core of the post there, and that will all be treated later with epoxy. So next slide, please. All right. And you can't really, because the sides are wavy and lumpy, you can't really rely on a straight edge on any couple of points. So he's, you know, got stickers set on the side so he can get a straight edge on there to get like a relative reference overall over the entire face. And he's just truing that thing up. And then if you look to the upper right, there is the extra veneer I mentioned to make up any material that was lost from sawing it off in the first place, or from the planing and adjusting to get everything true. And then if you look to the lower left, you'll see that, you know, these splices are kind of tested in place and clamped on. And then if you look to the lower right, you'll see there's one that is completed. So you can see, you know, it's hard to see the saw kerf at the right end, but you can see that little extra veneer coming up, you know, quite a ways. And then you're seeing half of the splice, you know, at the bottom, because the tongue of that splice is running up the opposite side. So we were able to really hide this very well. Now, if you can go to the next slide, please. All right. So now we have to deal with the timber connectors. We've got our post bases, you know, good and filled, but we have to make a slot that allows top and bottom, because we're going to set a timber connector up into the beam above. Remember, we had to remove the tenon. So we plugged the tenon hole, and then we drill up beyond that and into the beam and set a threaded rod with epoxy up there. And then these timber connectors have to go in there and into the bottom. So you can see first this is just timber frame practice. He's wasting out the mortise for the slot with the drill on the left, and then he's in there with a big timber chisel and, you know, slick and cleaning out the bottom of this thing. And then on the right, he's sort of testing the fit and the location, because he has to determine where he's going to drill for the cross dowel. Next slide, please. All right, now you see a prepared joint on the left. The cross dowel is ready to go. The slot is made, and that guy's sort of ready for installation. In the middle, you can see where there was some rot or material loss in between our timber splice and the original side we put on. Some of it could be visible in some locations. So there we're using pigmented epoxy and get that all filled up and set and ready to go. And then the last thing is that, you know, as I said, nothing is truly square. So you end up basically doing everything slightly oversized and trimming it back. So one of the last touches is Nathan is just block planing off the edges of those veneers that, you know, were protruding a little beyond the surface. So it's totally flush with the face of the splice. So there really is a lot of handwork. As much handwork went into fixing these as went into building this in the first place. If you could go to the next slide, please. All right. So now back at the site, you know, all of that stuff that you saw before, you know, played out over a couple of months' time, and we were back and forth from the site a lot, checking tolerances and measuring. So you can see there was a rather large hole that the pipe that was acting as a pin was occupying, and that in and of itself was a great place for bugs and rot. And you can see there's a split. These are two pieces of terracotta that line down the middle, moisture and everything else. So after we epoxied our threaded rod in, we went back and filled all of that with epoxy. So there wasn't a little place for moisture to puddle under the post or bugs to get in that way. And in the middle, you see Claudio is, you know, he's setting that threaded rod, or actually he's screwing one of the timber connectors onto the threaded rod up into the plugged mortise above. Now, so the cribbing still has to be there because we're still floating in air. And you can see where the guys have just slid one of those posts into place. And Nathan's got an Allen wrench in his hand down there, and he is tightening the cross dowel that locks that timber into place at the bottom. Please advance to the next slide. All right, so you get a view looking in to that, and the piece you see sitting in the front on the left there is the plug that is going to be epoxied into that hole. But you can see the timber connector, you can see the cross dowel going through. This was done top and bottom. Interestingly enough, even when there was a splice in the beam above, same methodology. And then you're looking at the yard side of the splice out here where you're not seeing the tongue of or you're seeing the full splice going all the way up the back and the little two veneers that are in there. So all in all, when you look at this, you can see how much lighter these posts are in color when you look at that center one. Now advance to the next slide, if you would. All right, so now you begin to see the kind of returning to the two-tone color scheme with the darker beam above. And in these photos, in the center photo, I believe the beam has been stained. I think the other two, we haven't stained it yet. But so you can see where we used, timber plugs to Douglas fir to hide the cross dowel pin that we needed access to for tightening the cross dowel. And if you look up at the right section of that photo, you can see the plug above the buttress in that same photo, Sam. There's like a stripe of lighter timber on the wood on the right hand side there, right? And I went back in later with earth pigments and the finish and photoed all those in to blend them in more so that they're not visible. And then the middle, the guys are assembling everything. This was really fun, putting those steel straps with those brilliant cross wedges back on there and putting them all in place. And then eventually we would nail all the counter flashings back on. And so you can see just how much texture these still have. The weathering is still there, but they just look so dramatically improved. If you would go to the next slide, please. So again, to the left, another view, and then you begin to see as we're staining the beam, it's starting to take on color. And, pins are starting to go back in the holes. We would eventually go over that beam and do a lot of the same epoxy filler and work at the site on that. It went through a cleaning process on site. It went through a stripping process and brushing and everything that all the timber that could be removed got. And then at the right, you see, you see that counter flashing I was talking about. And we have those kind of, forged copper nails that are back into the top, but also you can see the full epoxy fill. So we were able to leave you all that impression of the weathering in the timber, and yet everything is completely full and, should be much, much less vulnerable to any kind of weathering. So I think, these are repairs that are going to hold for a long time. And that epoxy, the fact that we're using earth pigments instead of chemical stains or dyes, means that it's going to be pretty light fast. So it'll probably stay that same color a lot longer, even when the wood starts to weather. Next slide, please. All right, so this is finished result. So the post at the far left is integral to the house. It couldn't be removed, but we were able to get it to look very much like the next three. So we did count back from the one at the corner, 1, 2, 3, 4. The post closest to you was part of an earlier repair that the Thorsen House staff had done. And we cleaned it up and gave it some color and then went on kind of darkening it. It had to get a little bit of treatment done to it. It was, everything was structurally great with it. It was just, it's a newer post, it's a replacement, but we had to pull the beam out of it to get the other one out. And, so after we did that, we let the house back down and took everything out. Next slide, please. All right, just, more of an extended view, and you can sort of see the beam has a consistent brown look to it, and everything else has its, dappled, tiger striped orange to grays kind of finish. And I think there's one more slide after this. Yes, looking back from the other direction. And what we did here was we made a clean spot. And I really am rooting for Signify and doing anything I can to help them publicize and fundraise. Because if you look to the left, you'll see that now that we've made a clean spot, it really shows up everything else to the left and right of that. And it would be nice to go on with shingles and cleaning and, fixing things with the fenestration and the window casings and the windowsills. And this house is such an enormous cultural legacy. It's a sort of construction that I don't think we'll see happening again. Even when people do modern knockoffs of this, they don't generally have access to quite this quality of material. The methods tend to be more modern. And this house is just as much of a treasure as all the other Greene and Greens in Southern California. So I'm happy to answer any questions that anyone has. And, again, I wish Signify all the best of luck in their ongoing efforts to take care of the house. They have the greatest of intentions. And I think moving forward, they're going to keep going. So thank you, everyone. Yeah. An interesting question. Okay. So I'm seeing them
Okay,
pop up
sorry,
at the bottom.
sorry about that, Chris. I couldn't unmute myself.
Oh, there we go.
So, unfortunately, we're all in close proximity down here. So we did have a few questions. Excuse me. We'll just go ahead with the ones in the chat. I, of course, have my own questions for you too. So actually, I'm going to start with mine just because I have that prerogative here. So it's so important to share these techniques and, what you find when you take things apart, because you had an opportunity that we've never had here at the Gamble House to actually see, for example, how those posts are attached to the deck and that kind of thing. So how much of that were techniques that you kind of had to develop as you went through the project, aside from the way that you did the splice and covered it, which it was really fascinating. But things like the way that you pigmented the epoxy and that kind of thing were techniques that I recognized from the Gamble House. So I was curious to know, what kinds of things did you sort of apply, things that you already knew how to do and that you already had experience with, and how many were things that were sort of specific to this house or specific to Greene Greene?
Well, I'm a general contractor who does anything a normal general contractor does, with the exception that we specialize entirely in old houses. In San Francisco, that generally means Victorians. In Berkeley, that generally means arts and crafts. We don't discriminate. We're working on a Richard Neutra modernist building right now here in the city. So old house mechanics. We also interact with all of the decorative arts. I'm part of this guild of period craft crazy people that's been around up here for 45 years in the city. I know you know some of them, the arts and crafts crowd particularly, and Ted Ellison and some of the others. And so we interact constantly on projects. And as a general contractor, I hire all these people to participate on my projects. So I learn a huge amount from my subcontractors, the techniques and things that they've done. I myself have a background in art, metalsmithing, and some conservation. And I just have been doing this for 30 years. And so you pick up a lot of techniques along the way. So all of the products that we were using, with the exception of this particular finish, TWP 1500, were things that were known to us. The epoxies are things we regularly use. Having to deal with them in a paint grade setting, and so they're visible and you're tinting them, wouldn't be typical for a Victorian or almost any other house, because most houses are painted. And so it wasn't too much of a stretch, and we'd kind of we'd gone through and figured out what we were going to do, and somewhere along the line, Tom shared me the Gamble House Conservators Report, and I was like, pretty much doing what I'd be doing. And so, so no surprises there. I mean, it's not an infinite list of products that you could use, and I've been working with earth pigments for years because of all the furniture repairs or conservation things that I've been doing. So, everything was pretty logical. I would have to say. I have been a student of everyone else's craft for as long as I can remember. I love timber framing and have always been hoping someone would wind me up and let me build one. And so, the ideas of this kind of splice, it's furniture joinery made big. And, we've done a lot of splice repairs over the years. So everything of this was a logical extent of everything we're regularly doing. But what was special about it was the fact that it is this appearance grade exterior timber on a house by architects whose work I have loved and admired forever. So it was like being given a great toy to play with. This was sort of a bucket list thing to get to work on this house. But on the other hand, it was also, the idea was that everything has to be done to just absolutely the highest standard, and anything we do needs to be credible, not only in appearance, but for the long haul. Because I did see a question that popped up about whether this was an oversight of the Greenes or if this was just time. I'm going to say that the Greenes were on a really quixotic quest when they built these things. Like it was high art. It's some of the finest examples of builder's craft of anything I can think of in the world. And yet it is so maintenance heavy that unless every subsequent owner stayed on top of it all the time throughout, years of deferred maintenance will do this to anything. And part of the issue, I'm not calling it a flaw, and it's definitely not an oversight. It's that, when you paint a house, that's a lot of protection from not just water, but UV. But when you have everything is exposed, all these finishes are there, and everything is sculptural and decorative, you have a whole special set of maintenance issues that you have to deal with. So. Yeah.
Well, we are very familiar with that here,
I'm sure.
Unfortunately. And, I certainly hope you'll get the chance to attack many projects that are clearly need to be done up there. So we had some of these other questions here. So Samuel was asking, aside from their appearance, were there any indicators that these beams needed to go through this restoration process? And also, do the metal straps help support the structure, or are they purely decorative?
I'm sure there is some structural additional strength coming from having these buttresses, strapped on there, but I think it's pretty negligible. The posts themselves are doing the work of holding up the building.
Yeah.
Having them locked in place is absolutely critical. It's a funny little anecdote is that I think a couple of weeks after we finished the project, there was an earthquake, like a 4.0 or something on the Hayward Fault, which this house sits on, 200 yards, epicenter 200 yards from the house. Wow. So we all we were happy that, before anything serious could happen, that this got done. And I know that was on California Sigma Phi Society's mind as well. It's sort of not a comfortable feeling having the foundation not bolted, the house not bolted to the foundation, and not having these posts really, in there. So it was absolutely necessary to do this. Now, you could consider it perhaps elective, some of the aesthetic lengths that we went to do it, hiding the splices and all the careful epoxy work, but preventing further weathering, yes, all the epoxy work was absolutely necessary. Getting those splices on there, getting those timber connectors on there, non-negotiable, absolutely vital. Something to ensure that this house is still here a century from now. And if everyone stays on top of the maintenance, around these posts, they're going to stay beautiful for a long time. So the idea with this kind of finish that we chose is, rather than catastrophic failure of a finish, which is where it eventually cracks like a varnish would, and you'd have to go strip it all off. This is a renewable linseed oil-based finish that every, couple of years you can go out, or at whatever schedule they want to, and recoat. So it's trading, it's giving you basically an ongoing maintenance process, but the good news is that you can do that and keep everything in great shape.
That's the same approach that was taken here 20 years ago when this project was done too. Jennifer's asking, how long was this process? How long did it actually take you to do all this work?
I think the whole thing, not including the preliminaries, all the back and forth, talking to the Sigma 5 board and like, how are we going to do, what's this going to cost, all that. I think the actual process took place over about 4 months, 3-4 months.
Okay.
It's a bit of a blur because that was last year. And now, I mean, this is the kind of thing we do all the time. So when the next project sort of blurs whatever was going on in the last one, it's always maybe not just the same thing, but it's always this intense. So.
Right. Okay. Michael's noting that there's much more restoration still to do on the house, and he wondered if there's a plan or a timetable for that.
Well, they have a long laundry list, and it goes in practical priority order, I believe, right? So what are life, health, safety issues? I believe right now they're remodeling 2 bathrooms inside while the kids are off from school for the summer, because that's definitely needed. And so, every one of these projects they're all competing priorities. They're all competing for the same limited pot of money. So we've been in discussions with them for restoring, basically doing to the entire western street facade of the house, kind of what we just did to those posts. And that project would involve, first of all, stripping the shingles off, getting the lower 4 feet of sheathing off, bolting that section to the foundation, because it can't be gotten at from the inside. It has to be gotten at that way. Other parts of the house, you can go in the basement and work from the inside to bolt it down without doing it. But then, sort of putting that, plywood sheathing back under that for shear value, and then, having all of these 3-foot long barn shakes made and replacing, the membranes, the underlayment, dealing with the ends of rafter tails and timbers and the portico and anything that is going through the same checking and issues that all the rest of the timber does. There's a lot of window casings that'll be on their service life. There's a lot of fenestration that needs some love. It is really what we just did in a microcosm on the back of the house, writ large across, I don't know how many hundreds of rafter tails there are in the front. All of the shingles, it's big voodoo. We had come up with sort of a budget for that. We decided that at the next available opportunity, we're probably going to make a clean spot that is like 10 feet high and 20 some feet wide, to the left of the portico and including the portico, so that we do everything that needs to be done to the front of the facade is contained within that square. And then that will serve both as a test case for what that will really cost. And also, it's a good fundraising tool when you can show people, look at the great clean spot we've made. Imagine what it would look like when the whole facade looks like this. So we're looking forward to that. And it's just a matter of, they need to get some other projects out of the way, and at some point I'm sure we'll get back around to that. So and the purpose, I should say, of applying for the Preservation Design Awards was entirely to give a status conferral function to their efforts of what they're doing, so that they can go to people and say, look, we're not playing around, we're really serious about what we're doing here. And so hopefully that helps with fundraising as well.
I would say so. I mean, we didn't know about this project. We knew that there was some work on the house, and we've of course talked to Rick about the shakes, and maybe we'll have to continue that that conversation. But it was the award that brought it to our attention. So Jennifer's also asking, was this project funded with private donations or through a grant opportunity? How did they raise the funds for it?
I'm not strictly privy to that information. I think that's something that one of them would have to answer. Maybe somebody can type it into the chat. I know that they have fundraising efforts, and that they had, set aside a pot of money for this. It definitely, when you play the game of logical extents on a project like this, there's always things you can not fix. There's places you can't go, oh no, we're not going to spend that money. And also, Tom and Rick were, very much of the mindset that, we need to bring life back to this, right? We can't ignore the aesthetics on this either. So there was a lot of conversation back and forth between them and us as to, okay, what is it? probably add to the budget if we need to go and strip everything now because the biological cleaner didn't do the work, right? And so it was this process of dialogue back and forth and approving funds, and the board, but I don't know exactly where all the funds they raised came from.
Okay. I mean, yeah, it's such a huge commitment for something that's not necessarily central to their mission. Right. So the fact that they've taken on this house over such a long time and are really doing this work is amazing.
Well, it's worth pointing out that they've owned the house longer than the Thorsens did. So
yeah, quite a bit. Let's see. So Sam was asking, how did you treat the metal strapping once you took it down? What kind of conservation did you do on those?
The metal straps themselves? Mm-hmm. We didn't take them off. Amusingly enough, that as I showed in one of the slides earlier on, to explore this process and decide whether they thought they would want to try it themselves, the Sigma Phi Society had taken those all off. And I remember it was amusing when we went looking for them because we couldn't find the buttresses. And it turned out that they were under a sheet in somebody's bedroom acting as sort of a side table or nightstand.
Oh, no.
Room, right? And I think the straps were all in the basement. And we literally did nothing to them. We left them as they were found with their patina and weathering over time. We did not wire brush them. We did not clean them up. I think they look just great as they are.
Wow. Okay. So Rick did put in the chat that the vast majority of the funding came from donations by our alumni to a 501c3 fund we have set up for restoration. So that's fantastic. I
had one.
Shows that ongoing commitment that people have to this place that they've lived and that they've loved, and yeah.
Oh, these guys are very committed to the house.
Yeah.
Clearly. I had a question for you, Chris. You were saying as much handiwork went into building this as it did to do the stabilization, right? Incredible craftspeople, really focused and doing such precision work in this project. I would love to just hear about how you are going about cultivating this next generation to continue to do this kind of intricate work to solve these kinds of problems that other green and green homes have, but certainly others with craftsman homes and people who are just, wanting to do right by their historic properties. It
takes a certain bent of personality to want to do this in the first place, right? Everyone I've ever met that is a restorer or a craftsperson, and that could be antique automobiles, that could be boats, whatever your thing is. You have to be willing to leap off a lot of cliffs because you're constantly being thrown into situations where, you thought you'd seen it all, but oh my God, look at that, right? And you have to find a way to solve a problem in a non-destructive fashion. And so it really takes a love of puzzles. I always say that we get the broken puzzles and we have to figure out what the missing pieces are and recreate them. And so, it starts with me having that sort of curiosity and a love of craft, and then loving to work with other people who share the same love of craft. And as a student of history, trying to figure out how we maintain some sort of place for working artisans, highly skilled artisans, to do their craft. And they don't teach this in school anywhere. There's one preservation trades program that I'm aware of in, I think it's in Charleston, where you can go study traditional stonework or traditional timber work or traditional ironwork. The National Park Service, I do believe, had a program in restoration that has been dismantled under budget cuts from the current administration. And so we also spent the last 50 years dismantling all of the vocational ed programs in most of the schools across the country in favor of trying to turn kids into tech workers. And so it's hard for people to find a place. I have an apprenticeship program, a working apprenticeship program. So it's not like I can do a vast bulk of people. It's as we need employees. They can come in sometimes they come in from the building trades. Sometimes they come in from having just gotten a degree in architecture and want to learn how things are actually done. I've trained a lot of people over the years. I have some out running their own preservation businesses now. I have some that have gone into the preservation planning side of things, after doing a hitch with us here. But we've had a lot of young people come through the door. I'm always trying to find, people, particularly when I can, that are in their 20s. And this is regardless of, gender or anything else. I've had young women do long hitches and apprentices with us here, men. But to give people the idea that this can be done, right? Because nobody does that anymore. Well, of course, we still do these things. And so it's fun for me to train, to share the knowledge. And it also creates a really fun culture around here, because when you have a bunch of people, especially with, an educational background and the curiosity and the love of historic building, then you can imagine the amount of fun we have working on this, because everybody's just jazzed about doing it and working together. So we've had a lot of luck over the years, and precisely because there's so few places that you could learn this, I anymore get cold called really by a lot of people who somehow find us through the Guild website or through word of mouth and say, hey, do you have a position open? We'd like to come work with you. So.
Great. So Rick pointed out for everybody's knowledge that the residents are always happy to give tours. Feel free to stop by anytime. The university is on break, so few people are here now, so it's best to come during the school term. And then Michael Gray says the residents of the Thorsen House are very generous with their time if you stop by. Rick is sitting in the living room of the house in front of the amazing fireplace. So I know that we've had a number of the students come down over the past year. They came down together about a year ago or a year and a half ago and toured the Gamble House. So we were really happy to welcome them so they could kind of get an idea of
they were really engaged in the project. They were fun,
wonderful,
super helpful, lovely to talk to, and were constantly out like looking at what was going on. They really cared, which was that also is fun for us. You're kind of on stage to a nice audience.
Yeah, what a learning experience for them too. Yeah. Okay, I think that we've covered all of the questions that we had. So I think we'll go ahead and wrap it up then. Alex, were you going to say a few words?
Yeah, just to say thank you, Chris. This was a fabulous presentation. It is just wonderful to have such wonderful visuals to see what work you accomplished. I think we're going to be kind of looking at the Gamble House in a few different ways now based on this work you've done and thinking about projects that lie ahead for us. But thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us. This was really a wonderful time to come together during Preservation Month and to see all of your smiling faces, those of you who have your cameras on. Please, near and far, stay connected with us. We've got a great number of docents on this Zoom right now, so we're always happy to see them getting more information and learning, along with Bruce Smith, who we're happy to see here in the Zoom with us today. Please keep up with us. Check our website for upcoming programs, and of course, follow us on social media and come to the house. Come and see us. So thank you again, everyone.
Mm-hmm. And if I just throw one last word in, it would be, we're very open source with anything around here. So anyone listening to this presentation, anyone at the Gamble House, want to compare ideas, look for things that are hard to source, let's stay in touch, because it takes everybody if we have any hope of preserving.
We're really glad to have that connection, Chris.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Great to see you on the Zoom too, Rick. All right, bye everybody.
Bye everyone. Bye-bye.